Hello, everyone. I'm so glad today to have a new episode of the podcast series Connecting Social Research to Society. I am with you, Sari Hanafi, a professor of sociology at American University of Beirut and the founder of the portal for social impact of scientific research in/on the Arab world, the portal called Athar. Today, I'm so honored to have a colleague and friend, Gary Fields. Hello, Gary.
Hello, Sari. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. Gary is an historical geographer and a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of California, Santiago, where he has been teaching and doing research for 23 years. He has a Ph.D. In city and regional planning with a specialization in economic history and historical geography from the University of California, Berkeley. Gary research focuses comparatively on land conflict and dispossession with an emphasis on Palestine. His book, Enclosure, Palestinian Landscapes in a Historical Mirror, was a finalist for the Palestine Book Awards in 2018. Gary has twice been a fellow for the Palestinian American Research Center, PARC, most recently in this year. In addition to his academic research, Gary Field is an engaged scholar writing op-eds for broad audiences in the US media and beyond, in venues like Jadaliyya and Counterpunch. His forthcoming book, we are looking for it, entitled Imprisoned, Voices and Images from Confinement Landscapes in Palestine. Most welcome. Ahlan wa sahlan, Gary.
Ahlan bik. Shukran, Sari, for that nice introduction.
Yeah. So, Gary, let me start first by how you grow up, how you come to become a geographer, how did you choose the geography, things like that.
Well, this would probably be a story that would take up your whole program, but I'll try to tell the story very quickly. My first love is actually history. And as an undergraduate, I majored in history. But at the time, there were very few history either teaching positions, or it was very difficult to use your history degree in the field of history. And so the other track here is that I'm kind of, as you said in your introduction, I'm an engaged scholar. And even as an undergraduate, I was beginning to get involved in political activity. I considered myself to be part of the labor movement, part of the left, and really in the Marxist tradition. This was a little while ago, you have to understand, because I was an undergraduate in the early 1970s. And after I finished my history degree, I thought it was really incumbent on me as an engaged scholar to put my radical politics into practice. And so I decided to not go to graduate school as I originally had planned. I was going to go to graduate school in history, but I decided instead to go back to my hometown of Chicago, and I got a job in one of the big steel mills in Chicago.
Oh my God, the steel mills.
Yes,
yeah.
I thought that it was really important as a labor activist to be directly involved in the labor movement.
Wow.
And so I worked for 5 years in a big steel mill in Chicago. As you might expect, by the end of that time period, I got laid off, and I started in 1978, and got laid off in 1982 because there was what we call deindustrialization that was coursing through the entire American industrial East and Midwest.
Yeah.
And therefore, I really had...
Moving the industry to a cheaper countries?
Yeah, this was a time when actually the main emphasis was Japan at the time, but then it became other areas like China much later, Korea. I think it was called the Four Tigers. I can't remember now, but
the tiger countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was in 1982. I was out of work. And I really didn't know what direction to go to at that point. And so you asked me, how did I get into geography? Well, I got into geography as a result of a kind of what we call historical accident. I heard about a woman at the University of California, Berkeley, who was doing a study, and this is 1983, a study on displaced steel workers.
Yeah.
Her name was Ann Markison. She's a very famous scholar in city and regional planning, historical geography. And I thought, maybe by some quirk I could get into that program.
Yeah.
And so I applied to that program because I already had a history degree.
Yeah.
And I was accepted into that program as a master's student.
When she saw you work 12 years in a mills and...
5 years in the mills.
Yeah.
I guess that got me into Berkeley. And so I applied at that time, 1983, applied as a master's student, a 2-year degree.
Yeah.
And moved out there from Chicago and began studies in city and regional planning with an emphasis on, at that time, just geography in general. And so after the 2 years were up, I worked as a city planner actually for almost 12 years.
Oh, wow.
And during that period, I also occasionally would do guest teaching in my department at Berkeley because the chair of the department asked me to teaching courses in city and regional planning and geography, which I did. And one day the chair sat me down, and this was, by this time, this was 1995, and the chair said, Gary, if you ever want to do a Ph.D. in city and regional planning, you have to do it now. Otherwise, you'll never do it, and you'll kick yourself for life that you never did it. So it's now or never. So you have to, if you want to do a Ph.D., you have to apply now. And so I decided, okay. At the time, I had a city planning job with the city of Oakland. I decided to just toss it aside and go for broke. And I applied to the Ph.D. program in city and regional planning at University of California, Berkeley, and got in 1997. And I went through the program specializing in economic history and historical geography and finished in 2002. And so that's really the broad trajectory of what brought me from history into geography, which I always thought that these two disciplines were closely related. And if you there are even, if you look at something like the Annales School, they were this group of historians from France. They were the ones that were sort of a model for me in bringing history, geography, and population studies together, and that was kind of an inspiration for me as well.
Great. So really, it's unusual trajectory to where you end up got your PhD and you got an academic job later on. I know that you went through academic position, teaching position, but also research. But I would like to tell us first about your PhD, because I think PhD it was very important in your I would say leftist trajectory as a scholar. I mean, interested in so.
My PhD was actually quite different from the work I'm doing currently. I was interested in as I said before, economic history and historical geography from a left perspective, from a Marxist perspective. I was interested in capitalist development as Marx understood capitalist development. So my PhD was really about, I was in a department at Berkeley, but I did something focusing on what historians call communications revolutions. So I looked comparatively at the 19th century and the late 19th century and the late 20th century, and I was comparing two different kinds of infrastructure, the rail and telegraph infrastructure and the internet infrastructure, and looking at how these two communications revolutions transformed patterns of economic development and historical geography on the land. I also looked at how power was used by corporations to transform the physical landscape in the United States. And so I did a very unusual kind of comparison. I looked at a meatpacking firm in the 19th century called Swift Meatpacking, because at the time, believe it or not, meatpacking was the most advanced and revolutionary industry in the world at that time, because it was an industry that utilized the railroad and telegraph in a completely different and revolutionary way. And I looked at how a firm like Swift used the infrastructure of rails and telegraphs to build not a local but a national market for the sale, distribution, and manufacture of fresh beef. This was completely different because meat was a local product. It was made by local butchers, local slaughtering. What Swift did was explode the localness of,
and become transportable,
and just grew the market into a national spatial market. So I looked at this, and I looked at what I argued was a parallel kind of revolution that was wrought by Dell Computer in distributing PCs to a world community of consumers of computers at the time. So I compared these two revolutionary firms and how they used communications revolutions to completely disrupt the existing patterns of production and distribution in capitalist development, as Marx had done in Capital when he was looking at how large industries had completely disrupted the patterns of capitalist development. And actually one of the models, one of the theorists at least that I used was, surprisingly enough, not a Marxist at all, but somebody who knew Marx very well, Joseph Schumpeter. And Schumpeter was a theorist who said that it was large capitalist firms that were disrupting capitalism to such an extent that they were actually leading society toward a socialist transformation. Now, Schumpeter was no socialist.
Say that, I know.
Schumpeter was no socialist, believe me, but he was a realist and believed that what was going on in the world of capitalist development at the time was trending toward exactly what Marx was describing in Capital.
I use a lot Schumpeter in my work to understand Palestinian diaspora, the entrepreneurship. I mean, his work on the entrepreneur, if you like. It's a very
that's right. That's right. His early work was on entrepreneurship, and I was what I was using was his sort of later work on business cycles and the large what he considered the model capitalist firm U.S. Steel, and how they were had completely transformed patterns of economic development. So that was my first book, and as you can see, it was called Territories of Profit, and it was very different from the work that I'm doing now. But there was an element to it that kind of was a forecast of what I was doing later, because what I was looking at in Territories of Profit was how these firms were transforming the physical landscape in creating new kinds of capitalist enterprise, first of all, and patterns of production and distribution. So it was the power of these firms that they were using to impose a new kind of landscape for economic activity and profit making.
Yeah, yeah. And this is the reason why you move to study Palestine. I mean, is it what kind of bring you to our region? I think my Arab audience will be very interested to know how you started from United States to move.
Well, this is another maybe interesting story for your audience, and let me just take 2 minutes. I'll try to tell it very briefly. At the end of my book, Territories of Profit, I was going to take I wanted to celebrate. It was I think an achievement that I was very proud of, and I had been active during my Ph.D. in Students for Justice in Palestine, just as a kind of a sideline. And after Territories of Profit appeared, there was a group of professors at Berkeley, along with a couple of professors on the East Coast, that organized a group called Faculty for Israeli-Palestinian Peace.
Yeah.
And this was in 2002.
Yeah.
2002, 2003.
Yeah. Where we met the first time in Palestine.
When we met. Well, they asked me if I wanted to be on this delegation.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I've never been there, and I thought it would be a compelling thing. Yeah. I went, and I had just gotten the job at the University of California, San Diego. Yes. When I finished my PhD, I was immediately hired.
Yeah, very good.
With good fortune. They asked me if I wanted to be part of this faculty delegation, and I said, well, I'm interested in that. I came to Palestine in December of 2003.
Yeah. And Judith Butler was with this delegation.
She was with this delegation.
Yeah.
And there were many really interesting people that we met and that were part of this delegation. And it was all very new, because that was some of the early period of the Intifada. And, you know, as somebody who studied land and landscape, when I came, and I remember it very distinctly, and it's actually the beginning part of my book, and Enclosure, when they took us to in Aram, Bet Hanina, the area where Israel had just constructed this wall at Kalandia. And I remember it was winter, and there was it was clear but very windy, and I cast my gaze out onto this concrete wall that was sweeping across the Palestinian landscape from east to west.
Yeah.
And I stared at this structure. And, you know, I am old enough. I've seen the Berlin Wall. I saw that several times. But I had never, ever seen anything like this in my life. And I said, my goodness, this is really something that I think a geographer could contribute to. And at the time, I really had no idea how I could make a unique contribution to the literature on Palestine. But I thought, as someone who studied space and landscape, maybe I had something to say that would be different from some of the other scholars within Palestine studies. And so I began to furiously do all the reading. And my first point of reference, the first thing that I thought of when I saw that wall was actually something that is probably very obscure to your listeners, but it's called the English Enclosure movement, the early modern dispossession of small tenant farmers in England. I thought of the parallels between large estate owners dispossessing small tenant farmers in early modern England in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. This occurred over the course of 3 centuries. And the power that they used to dispossess these small farmers. And I thought of Israel doing a similar kind of thing with
Exactly.
Palestinians. So I thought, okay, maybe there is a comparison that I could make, because my first book was a comparative,
Yeah.
comparative.
The Enclosure.
That was comparative historical sociology. I thought there was something I could do along this line. And, you know, for the second time, I came again to Palestine in 2004, and I met with Raja Shahade.
Yeah, Raja Shahade.
Shahade. And I knew him because I knew his work, and I knew he was a property rights lawyer, a lawyer about property. I asked to meet with him, and we met in Ramallah. And I told him my idea about this comparison with the English enclosure movement. And I'll never forget the look on his face. He said, I have been waiting for someone to do this comparison. And I said, oh my goodness. And so he gave me a lot of confidence that this idea was a good one, and that I could use this as a platform for doing some kind of unique comparative analysis of land and landscape in Palestine, and make a unique contribution to Palestine studies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I read most of the book, and I think the book is revolutionary to understand the process of colonization, particularly of West Bank and Gaza, but also I think this parallel you do between exploitation and dispossessions as a part of neoliberal capitalism, if you like, and much earlier in your case in the capitalist per se, and what Israel is doing is very important, and I see so much parallel between your work and Michael Barawi work. You know, recently Michael Barawi, the former president of the International Sociological Association, and he's in the University of Berkeley. He gave a keynote just 2 weeks ago in the European Sociological Association, exactly showing that in fact the colonial specificity, if there is a specificity with the colonial project in Israel, it's really continuation of this this large movement of dispossessions and apartheid, and you know he is South African origin, I think, or who work a lot there, so he drew parallel also between South Africa and Israel, and it was really very, very important. So just I say that to salute your work, Gary, really amazing. Let me, before later on I will ask you about your forthcoming book and your forthcoming work, but I'm more interested in how you connect your work to the public. And so I know your writing. I mean, I was positively surprised that since 7 October you have written at least I read 2 or 3 articles in 2 in Jadaliyya. So can you tell me first, before going that, how you, as academics based in the United States, you ensure this kind of dissemination? This is. I need to start general, and then I will go to your 2 pieces you wrote in Jadaliyya. Please.
You have to understand that I came to academia through a different route than most of my colleagues. I mean, I worked in a big steel mill. I was politically active for a long time before I decided to go into academia. So I always believed that it was important when I went to academia to be what I think many describe as an engaged scholar. I think it's absolutely crucial to be connected in your scholarly work to the general public. As soon as I began to teach at UCSD, I started there in 2002, 2003, just as the Iraq War was beginning. And I thought, I have to write something about this terrible travesty. And I began to write op-eds in the San Diego Union Tribune and the much bigger Chicago Union Tribune about the way that the Bush administration was misleading the public. And since then, I've written probably at least 20 kinds of op-eds in newspapers, because I think it's critical to have some kind of communication with the broader public. I think we have to be principled and careful in our scholarly work, but we also have to have a voice in a broader forum. And so, as I was doing work in Palestine, I have been engaged in writing op-eds every year, virtually. Now, since October 7th, I've thought of it as an even more critical job that I should do. And so I have begun to explore new kinds of venues to express opinions that probably would be very controversial, that probably are controversial, but I think are speaking the truth. And so I published in my first two pieces in Jadaliyya, a couple pieces in Counterpunch. I even published a piece of writing in a photography magazine, because some of my work involves photographic images. And I was very surprised. I published an article about the photography of protest, and that got me a lot of readers and reader comments. But I think from this woman I mentioned earlier, as we were discussing, Professor Ann Markison at Berkeley, she was the one who always taught me about engaged scholarship. And I've tried to use that as a model for what I do. And I think and that's the motivation for the recent articles that I've been writing since October 7th. I think it's critical to really explain what the truth is about October 7th and after.
I think I read both articles, and really the first one where you compare you ask this question, why Hamas did it, and you give us a historical perspective that in a protracted conflict where the oppressed reach no pacific path of resolution, can be very violent. And you brought the case of the slaves in United States, and really in my talk, I would say in the last year, I use extensively, Gary, your work, because I think such comparison, I mean, to remind humanity that in fact there is some really general theoretical rules on life, and something like the slave. It was revolt. It was very violent. Sometimes I use the Warsaw Ghetto revolt as well. I think at a certain point you mentioned it also. So this is really. Can you tell us how? I mean, when you write a piece, I mean, how much you think that you need to put your research versus, if you like, more engaged with the contemporary, or not contemporary, with the hot issues? I mean, how you play with the distance, if you like? This is my question.
I always think that comparison is the best way of understanding the world we live in, and especially historical comparison. Now, I'm very gratified that you read the Jadaliyya article, because it seems that you understood it well, but many people who talk about October 7th really know very little, especially in the United States, because that's my primary point of reference here. They know very little about their own history. And if we go back to the period before the Civil War, there is a very famous slave revolt that was led by somebody by the name of Nat Turner. And this has become an iconic moment in American history, because Nat Turner led a revolt of slaves that was very violent. And the revolt resulted, I think, in the killing of 54 whites in Virginia. Now, and I mean, anybody might be inclined to condemn this, but you know, now the Nat Turner revolt has assumed this iconic status. It's almost something that is mythical, and we tend to have a much more forgiving perspective toward the Nat Turner revolt. Well, really, what I was arguing at the end of the piece that you're describing in Jadaliyya, what I was trying to, the point I was arguing is, I said, let us look at Nat Turner's revolt as a lens, because these slaves when they revolted, they were desperate, they were enslaved. If you read any of the slave narratives, if you read books about what it was like on the plantation, if you read a book like River of Dark Dreams, if you read these accounts that slaves have left about the violence that was perpetrated against them by the slave owners, you see the level of desperation that they had. They had no other option but to revolt against those who were oppressing them. If we fast forward to October 7th, if we think about the situation in Gaza, and I was fortunate because I had journalism pass. I was one of the few researchers able to go to Gaza, and I visited Gaza 6 times from 2005 to 2017. I know what the blockade was. And actually, officially, the blockade begins in 2007, after 1 year after the elections of 2006. But really, realistically, Gaza was blockaded since the mid to late 1990s. And what we're talking about is a cage for 2 million people who cannot go in, cannot go out. The level of desperation here, the level of impoverishment, the level of oppression is such that after, let's say, decades of this, what are the Gazan people to do? And I think that's what ultimately motivated what we saw on October 7th. And I argue that this was similar to what Nat Turner and his band of slaves did earlier in American history to overcome the oppression that they had experienced at the hands of slave owners. So I've always looked for parallels, in this case, slave owners and Zionist Israelis. These are the same thing. In my book, Enclosure, the argument that I was making is that English estate owners, Anglo-American colonists, and Zionists are performing the same kind of historical role. The Zionists are always fond of saying, well, we have a unique historical situation. No, they don't. They are doing precisely what their predecessors, their colonial predecessors did.
And Ian Lustig also extended to French colonies in Algeria. I mean,
absolutely.
His work in the parallel between both is very interesting also.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is the argument. What Zionists are doing is no different from, say, what the French did in Algeria, what the English did in Australia, what the Anglo-Americans did in North America. And even what I argue in my book, Enclosure, is that the English estate owners were performing what many English historians have called internal colonization. That is, the estate owners were internally colonizing the landscape, throwing these small farmers off the land. It's the same thing. Zionists are doing precisely the same thing as all these predecessors. And what's of course interesting about the Zionists is that they have begun and have perpetrated their colonial project after all these others have finished. And they are continuing it. And they are perpetuating it to this day.
Maybe this is a good a transition to your second pieces where you talk about Zionism and in parallel of some of the Nazi. Can you tell us about this piece? And I knew that you had some headache from your work about it. Can you tell us about that, because this is very important? This is also a piece from Jadaliyya.
Yeah, well, I have two pieces about this. One is called Nazis: The Fraught Politics of a Word and a People Besieged. And I wrote this. I actually started writing this in November of last year. I mean, it took a little time to appear. And the question I asked here is, and many are starting to ask this question, I thought it was time to ask the question, are the Israelis behaving like the Nazis did? And there was another piece that inspired me in this, and this was I thought a heroic article in the New Yorker magazine, excuse me, by Masha Gessen. And what she was arguing is that what the Zionists were doing in Gaza was akin to what the Nazis were doing in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were liquidating the ghetto. So, and that was that kind of.
It was in November. Yeah,
sometime around this, and I was thinking, yes, this is really I think this is a compelling kind of comparison, and as a kind of comparisonist, I had a lot of respect for Gessen's piece, and I began to think of the similar kind of thing, and I asked what I did is I asked the question in my piece. I asked the question, how was it, or how is it? Because I asked the question, how is it that a group of people who claim to be descendants of such a horrific crime during the Holocaust, how could they turn around and essentially behave almost essentially like their tormentors? And so I went back to the Nazis, because if you look at in the broad sense of what the state of Israel has done, what they have done on the landscape in creating ghettos, what they have done in creating partitioned walls all over the Palestinian landscape, in creating checkpoints with all kinds of draconian measures for on freedom of movement. I asked the question, how is it that a group of people could behave exactly as their tormentors? And I began to ask, what historical source might provide us with some insights about this? And believe it or not, I found two sources that provide us clues to this question. One of them is probably a source that most people would never think of. It's a conservative French aristocrat by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. And I have a lot of respect for de Tocqueville. He was an extremely brilliant, a brilliant thinker, a conservative, but a brilliant and honest thinker. I mean, also a colonialist, by the way.
Absolutely.
He was absolutely.
His writing about Algeria is very different from his fascination of the democracy.
He was a big supporter of colonialism in Algeria. So I'm not going to say that he was an angel. But he wrote a book on the French Revolution that even many later Marxists still have a lot of respect for. But one of the questions that de Tocqueville posed at the very beginning of the Ancien Regime and the revolution is he said, how is it that the radicals like Robespierre and Saint-Just, who had so many aspirations of creating a different kind of society, basically imitated the absolutism of their tormentors. And what he said, and I read this book many years ago, but it stuck with me. What he said is that they were men who were brought up in the hothouse of absolutism. This is all they really knew. And so when the time came for them to create something different, they fell back on what they had already been conditioned to know, and they unwittingly created something that looked just like the absolutism that they wanted to destroy. So I thought this was it's simplistic, but at the same time very brilliant. And there was Marx, just a couple years before, said something quite similar, actually, in one of his most famous quotations from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Because, I mean, Marx was looking at something a little bit different than de Tocqueville, but what Marx was trying to explain was how is it that these revolutionaries of 1848 succumbed, or how was it that Louis Napoleon was able to take over, succeed so easily? And what Marx said in this book, the 18th Brumaire, is he said history repeats itself once as tragedy and once as a farce.
He was making fun from Napoleon.
He was making fun of
imitating his
uncle or
his uncle. Yes.
Yeah, he was. And how was it that we get to a point where the French revolutionaries succumbed to this kind of dictatorship that they too in 1848 were trying to overcome? And so what we get from both de Tocqueville and Marx is this idea that history is replete with all of these examples of human actors who have been reared in the hothouse of absolutism, and they somehow create exactly what they said they did not want to create. So coming back to the question, though, the Zionists basically do the exact same thing. They claim to, be the inheritors of this of the horrors of the Holocaust. Never again is their motto. But in fact, it's not never again, it's again and again, because they too have succumbed to this very same logic that we find in de Tocqueville and Marx. They are doing exactly the same thing. And it's just extraordinary how close the parallels really are. Now, very few people will ask or will argue that, because it's politically very incorrect to say that the Zionists are behaving like Nazis. But I'm going to say it here, and your audience can quote me here. I don't think there's any question that the Zionists, because of this conditioning that they have had, have behaved exactly like the Nazis. What they are doing is they are essentially creating in Gaza a death camp. And that's the term I used in my Counterpunch article to describe what they are doing. They are essentially bombarding and besieging a defenseless population that has no real way of fighting back. They have no air defenses, they have no tanks, they have no planes, they have no real organized military force. They have Hamas fighters, but that is all against one of the most mechanized and highly trained armies in the world. And what we see day after day for the last 11 months is Israel simply besieging and bombarding these people day after day, killing them. And I used the parallel here of what there's a film that was the Jonathan Glazer film. Now I'm forgetting. You can see I'm forgetting the title.
Film about what?
It was about the
it's not important title.
It's not important, but what I was using is that there was a scene in this film, Jonathan Glazer's film, about the Nazis. It's about a family that is, the father is the camp commandant, and they have a house just adjacent to Auschwitz. And there's a scene in the film about. And it's kind of almost taken from Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil, in which these various camp commanders are sitting around a large table, and they're discussing the logistics, the banality of the logistics of how they are going to put to death 700,000 Hungarian Jews, the process of moving them and the logistics of this. Now, I was comparing that to some images we see on Al Jazeera newscasts of the war cabinet, the Israeli war cabinet. Exactly. You see these fleeting images, and the Israeli war cabinet and these images and what they must discuss at these meetings of how they are going to liquidate another building, another family, another 50, 100 Gazans.
About Rafah, for instance.
Rafah, day
and
after day.
They know it will be.
They know it will be. They know they are going to kill tens, even hundreds sometimes of people, and they just do it. So this is just like this film. It's just like what the Nazis have set up. They've created. Literally a death camp in Gaza.
Once when I was living in Palestine, I used to go from time to time to the Cinematheque in Jerusalem. And you remind me this story. Once it was a screening of the film The Pianist. It's about the famous, a Jewish family from Warsaw Ghetto, and this pianist, how he survived, etc. And the whole story, the film is really very moving. I mean, about Warsaw fate, if you have Warsaw Ghetto, and so while I was walking out in the of the Cinematheque, one Israeli. So we have a friend, etc. So introduced to each other, say, "Sari Hanafi Palestinian," and the first things this Israeli told me, "I am sure you are thinking that what we are doing with you now." In the wall, and it's the same about this film. I was shocked that he actually. I was really somehow thinking.
You were thinking
on this,
that.
But I mean, I noticed that even Israelis, they and later on I get to know this guy, which is not really. I would say a radical anti-Zionist guy. No, but I mean, he felt that Israel, was doing in 2001, 2002 is what the Nazi did with the Warsaw Ghetto. So what kind of reaction did you get from your university when you published the piece about this parallel? I mean, this comparison you did.
There were a few people who said, well, you know, this is going a little too far. But you know, I was also, they thought that the idea that you could compare the Nazis to the Zionists of today was something that was absolutely unacceptable. Yeah. And there were two people in particular who I was really interested in. These were not colleagues specifically at my university, but these are sort of Zionist colleagues who I respect. And I sent, you know, I asked them about the article, and they said there's no way. First, and the way they argued against it though is interesting. They said that okay, the number of people that Israel has killed is nowhere near what the Nazis killed, and it's true. Yeah. Okay, it's true. Yeah. I mean,
but the comparison, it was about the process.
Yeah,
about.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant anyway. It's not the numbers. If you look at if you look at how the World Court defines genocide, they don't define genocide as okay. If you reach the threshold of 1 million killed, then you have genocide. There's nothing like that. So there's a guy at Harvard who I pointed this out to, because he was telling me that the numbers don't match up. I said that's irrelevant. They don't have to match up, and he didn't really respond. He didn't respond to that because there is no response. There was another fellow at UCLA, closer to my university. I'm not going to say their names here because, but his first name is, the first guy's name is Derek, and the second guy's name is Dov, and he said he didn't even engage with the article. He said you've totally discredited yourself by suggesting that what Israel is doing is compares to the Nazis, and I think what they're trying to suggest is that the Nazis are completely unique, and you know they're not. It's I mean, every situation is unique.
And actually, Hannah Arendt, her work about the authoritarianism. I mean, she drew many comparison between Stalinism and Nazism.
Well, Hannah Arendt was already suggesting in the
1943, I think, maybe where she wrote, say, if you have a plan of colonize Palestine, you will.
Well, she was already recognizing that there were fascist elements in the Zionist movement, and she was very uncomfortable with it. And she was also a signatory to a letter that some Zionists had written to in the New York Times.
Einstein.
Einstein was part of this, and several others. I can't remember who, but they were objecting to an invitation that had been sent to
Begin, Menachem Begin.
To Menachem Begin.
Yeah.
As one of the head
of
US,
the Haganah.
Well, I think. No, the Stern Gang.
Stern Gang.
The Haganah. They wrote a letter saying these are part of fascist elements, and that this is you should not do this.
Be invited by United States.
And so she was already aware that Zionism had this uncomfortable symmetry. Let's put it this way, to be fair, there were aspects of Zionism that had an uncomfortable symmetry with Nazi elements. That's what she said. Or that's what the letter said. And she explained herself in an essay about this that I think is very important, called Zionism Reconsidered. And she was very upfront about the parallels between Zionism and aspects of Nazism. Now, of course, later she kind of backtracked on much of this, but you know, she was aware of this.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
this, as you were suggesting, this was very much in the air, as we say, at a very early date. Zionism was not, these were not angels by any means. And now to make now after 1948, to make the comparison, you are taking a big risk. And so nothing, you know, look, I still have my job, so I can't say that I was victimized here, but you know, there are many people now who are suffering immensely, not even saying the kinds of things that I've been saying about Zionism and Nazism. They're only saying the most obvious things about what the state of Israel is doing and are getting sacked. And I refer specifically to a law professor now at Columbia by the name of Catherine Franke. Her case is really, I think, it's emblematic of what is occurring in American universities right now, because, you know, we have a state religion in Zion. I mean, this will be controversial, but I don't really care about it because I think it's the truth. We almost have a state religion in the United States. It's called Zionism. And if you deviate from this, I mean, Zionism has permeated every institutional channel of American life. And it's the proof of that is what has happened since October 7th. You look at businesses.
And the encampment,
you look at universities. Repression. In businesses, universities, all kinds of different institutions that have state governments, the federal government, all of these institutions have basically drawn a line and said you cannot cross the line where you criticize Israel, otherwise there will be consequences. And it's startling. It's startling to see this in the United States, which of course prides itself on the world's most vibrant democracy, the birthplace of freedom of expression. But it's become one of the most repressed and, I mean, unfree societies when it comes to freedom of expression.
A few days ago, I was looking to the Academic Freedom Index, and I realized that both United States and UK went...
1, 2.
Historically was among the best 20, and now is going down.
19 and 20. Yeah, it's really striking. And you know, the things that I've argued, I mean, I've been arguing some of the most radical things, but even arguing very straightforward kinds of, even calling for a ceasefire has now been labeled anti-Semitic, because the big problem, of course, is the way that the Zionists have managed to conflate Zionism with anti-Semitism. This, of course, is the biggest issue of our time.
Yeah, I mean, if you like, I can understand from your reply that connecting research to the public, where you will have much more headache than, for instance, writing a whole book of Enclosure, for instance, where you draw so many parallelism to understand this colonial project in Palestinian territories.
So, in an historical sense, and arguing that the Israeli colonial project is no different than the other ones from the past.
So maybe this time to tell us about your forthcoming book. We look forward to see it. I have a pleasure to attend your talk at AUB a few months ago, where we saw amazing pictures. I mean, landscape, how has been changed. So can you tell us a little bit?
The new book is entitled Imprisoned, Voices and Images from Confinement Landscapes in Palestine. In a sense, the book is a sequel to the Enclosure book. But what I'm doing in this book is I am letting Palestinians speak in their own voice about their experiences with the landscape that Israel has imposed on the confinement system that Israel has imposed on the Palestinian landscape. Their experiences in terms of daily encounters with the freedom of movement, the really intense restrictions that have been placed on them. And I'm supplementing these stories that they are telling me with my own photographs, because I'm a pretty good photographer, so I'm supplementing their descriptions of their daily life under this confinement system with my own photos. So the book is 15 different locales. I am looking at one individual in each of these Palestinian locales, letting that individual tell the story of their life experience with confinement in their daily life, supplemented with my photographs.
Yeah.
Now, that gets to the question of what am I doing here in Lebanon?
Yeah.
Well, I had an idea for the final chapter of the book. The final chapter of the book is going to be a locale in a Palestinian refugee camp here in Lebanon, because the experience of the Palestinian in the camp in Lebanon is quite similar to the idea of confinement. But I thought in some ways, it could be a book on its own, but in some ways the confinement here runs along two tracks. On the one hand, the Palestinian refugee in the refugee camp here in Lebanon is confined by a line that Israel has drawn that prevents Palestinian refugees from returning to their homes and homeland. That's kind of a classic definition of confinement. They can't cross the line back to their homes. But there's another kind of line that exists for the Palestinian refugees in the refugee camp. And that is a line that the Lebanese government has imposed. It's not a physical line in the same sense. It's kind of a metaphorical line that the Palestinian cannot really cross to access their full menu of rights here in Lebanon.
Absolutely.
So they are confined here in the camp in Lebanon in two kinds of ways. I mean, for instance, as you know, the Palestinian refugee...
I would say this parallelism between these two confinement is really very important to be drawn.
And I thought this would... It didn't, while I was writing the book...
I strongly encourage you to pursue
Well, this is the whole reason why I came, because I thought of this idea didn't come to me at the beginning of the book, or even while I was writing it. It came to me at the very end, because most of the book is written, but I thought, oh my gosh, I am leaving out one of the major places where this confinement is so real and so visceral that I have to include it. So, that's why I'm here to do the interview, the one or two interviews that I want to use for the final chapter for a Palestinian refugee camp here in Lebanon, as emblematic of the kind of confinement that they confront, but in this case on these two levels. So that's the fieldwork task that I'm trying to accomplish while on this trip now.
Okay. By the way, I have an article where I classify Palestinian refugee camps, and I consider particularly refugee camps in Lebanon as a closed space. So I distinguish between, I grew up in the Yarmouk camp, where it's an open space. It means that there is a continuity between lower middle class localities around the camps and the camps itself. Sometimes you don't know that whether you are crossing the line or not. But in Lebanon, it's a huge difference between the Dubai camp and the Dubai, between Ain al-Hilwi and Saida.
Well, I'm trying to get into Ain al-Hilwi. I have, there's two organizations here that are helping me immensely, and that's Al-Najda and Jana. Both of these organizations.
Yeah, very good, excellent.
They have been.
They are two excellent
I couldn't do it without them.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it without those organizations.
Yeah.
And I'm still waiting, hopefully, to see if I can get this permit into Ain al-Hilwi in Saida. I mean, your mom lives in Saida, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure you know. I mean, I've never been.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping Monday we'll see.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Gary.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It was really an amazing episode with you. Thank you, our dear audience, and hopefully to have another episode soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Sari, for inviting me. I really had a very nice time talking to you, and I hope that this podcast turns out really well for your listeners.
Thank you.